The internet has taken over our lives. You might have seen this updated version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where Wi-Fi has become more important to us than basic sustenance like food and shelter. But with the pervasiveness of online use, what has also increased is the amount of information being gathered about us, and generally by private corporations. Every single breath we take, every single move we make, we are being watched. And yes, that is from a famous Police song.
I'll be watching you.
Data about our heart rate is being gathered by our smartwatches. Data about which cities we visited, which bars we hopped, how many steps we took when we went downstairs to pick up our mail is being stored and gathered in data centers spread around the world. Now, why is this data being gathered? The argument that tech companies make is that the more data they have about us, the better products they're able to build for us that we love. So for instance, when Google gathers data about our movement and the places we visit through Google Maps, it makes Google Maps much more better, and we are able to find ourselves in the middle of a tiny street in Cuba or in a village in Pakistan. We can get around now better than ever because of Google Maps being as awesome as it is. As we talked in the last 2 episodes, the business model for Google and Facebook is through ad revenue. So this data is used to serve more relevant ads to us through ad tech software or to do it more efficiently. Serving these ads across multiple platforms and multiple websites that we visit is more likely to make us click on that ad and to eventually, maybe after some research, buy that product. Now, there is nothing wrong with this process, and it is taken from the oldest marketing tactics in the book. But when it becomes a problem is when user activity data is collected across multiple platforms, apps, and websites, and then it is connected to a demographic profile of the user, for instance, their location, their gender, their preferences, how much time they spent on a website. When all this information is put together by the ad tech company, then it builds a user profile for you. This type of advertising is called behavioral advertising, and this is why we see similar kinds of ads popping up across our different web pages and activity. Lately, pretty much every website we visit asks us to accept its cookies, right? Now, I don't know about you, but generally when I'm surfing the internet, I'm like in a hurry to get the information I need and get the hell out, right? So I'm likely to press yes or no on these cookies without reading much detail. But that brings up the question of what is the purpose of these cookies and why do we need to be bothered about it? When you visit a website that uses cookies, and almost all websites use cookies now, a small text file with basic information about you is stored in the web browser. Since publishers have moved to programmatic advertising, they open up their websites to a lot of these trackers and also third-party trackers which keep an eye on user activity on their website. But if you look at the number of trackers which are accessing that user data, sometimes it is impossible to identify which these websites are or which these trackers are or where this user data is going. But now at this point, if you're anything like my mom, you're going to say, I don't really care if Facebook has all of my data, or I don't really care if my data is being stored across different web pages, right? Because let's be honest, platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram have allowed all of us to build the narratives of our lives online. We all write our own autobiographies and stylize them in whatever way we want to be remembered or known. We might even like the idea of being shown ads that are relevant to us. So let's say a diaper commercial or ad does not pop up in a teenager's newsfeed, right? So who cares? Why it matters is unfortunately multifold. Apart from the very obvious government surveillance aspect, where in countries like Russia or China, online user behavior is being tracked, and sometimes in the United States as well. And that is a bit of an issue, but our data is also being shared with third parties that we did not give permission to use our personal information. This increases consumer risk, and this is also why we are seeing a spike in cyber crimes and online identity theft. So basically, when we share our information with one website or one platform, it could be shared with an unlimited number of websites and platforms. So you're not just saying yes to one. This data can also be used in more convoluted forms, such as the Cambridge Analytica use case, where millions of Facebook users' data was used to target their political preferences or voting preferences in the United States. Now, in 2018, the European Union, which is the political and economic union of 27 European countries, implemented one of the strictest privacy and security laws in world history, called the Gdpr, or General Data Protection Regulation. The main reason for passing these laws was that US-based companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Twitter were gathering data about European Union nationals and then manipulating this information for their own business ends. This kind of activity of private entities in a nation state gathering personal data about another nation state's nationals would have been unthinkable a few decades ago or before we started becoming so open with the internet, and might even have consisted of espionage in a different era. Now, the GDPR is extremely expansive and rather complex, but essentially the maximum of 20 million euros or 4% of world revenue turnover can be fined to these companies who break the GDPR regulation and laws. The GDPR is meant to give back control and ownership of user data back to the users rather than external parties owning this data. It is also meant to protect users from data breaches caused by third-party trackers, or to even allow them a right to be forgotten, which is basically if you were to say that, hey, I do not want this information of me to exist on the internet anywhere, you can contest that and you can make a case for it.
I think there's two things at stake here. One is our sort of digital citizens' right, that we have the right to our own data, to be forgotten, to understand what it is that we sign up for. Here, I still think we have some way to go. I'm the kind of person who reads terms and conditions for fun. We are very, very few. Most people, they just sign off. And I think we still have way to go to make sure that we do not only have rights, but that we can also exercise our rights. The second thing, of course, is what kind of responsibility will a platform have?
Now, we won't get into the nitty-gritty of GDPR, which is a sweeping regulation over here, but these are the 7 main principles of the GDPR and give a good sense of what they're trying to do with this regulation. Number 1, lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. This is required of all organizations in the US that use European nationals' data. And it's basically the very, very long terms and conditions that we say yes to very quickly. Those are required by this law to be provided to us so that we understand what we are agreeing to. Number 2, purpose limitation. This is about gathering user data or using user data only for the purpose as stated by the organization and not for any other purpose. Number 3, data minimization. This means that only the relevant amount of data should be gathered, which is for above purpose, correct? So for instance, if I give access to Facebook to my user data and tell them that they can use it to make the news feed more exciting, then they cannot use my data from, let's say, Tumblr or some other web page that I haven't given them access to. They can only gather the data that they say serves their purpose. 4, accuracy. This means that a user can contest inaccurate or incomplete information about themselves that might live on the internet. 5, storage limitation. This means that, let's say, I delete my Facebook account. That means that Facebook cannot keep my user data on its cloud or somewhere around the world anymore. Number 6, integrity and confidentiality. This means that personal data must be stored or gathered in a way that ensures security of that data. Number 7, accountability. This is pretty clear where the organizations or company are accountable to follow all of these regulations in GDPR region. Now, on January 21, 2019, the French Data Protection Authority imposed a fine of 50 million euros on Google LLC under the EU General Data Protection Regulations Act, so the GDPR. This was the largest fine put against any tech companies under the GDPR so far. Most recently, Google's appeal was also rejected in the French courts. Now, GDPR is providing a good starting point for these privacy regulations, and it's providing a framework that is being used around the world right now to come up with more regulations against big tech, when it comes to privacy laws and user data tracking. Similar regulations are currently under discussion at a federal level in the United States, but there is no general overarching law that has been passed so far. Following GDPR, California became the first state in the United States to pass its own version of privacy laws called the California Consumer Privacy Act, or the CCPA, in June 2018. In 2019, Nevada followed suit and passed its own privacy laws, which gave consumers in the state the right to opt out of the sale of their personal information. And a couple of weeks back, Virginia also passed similar laws at state level. To dig deeper into today's topic, we'll be talking with our expert, Quinn Norton. Quinn is a writer who likes to hang out in the dead-end alleys and rough neighborhoods of the internet. She's been published in Wired, The Atlantic, Salon, amongst many others, as an expert. Quinn, so what is tracking, in your words, and why should people care about it?
Tracking can mean a lot of different things. Essentially, at its core, it's identifying someone or a cohort of someone's for some amount of time and attaching attributes to them. And that's very abstract. But sometimes it can mean we know that you're in Los Angeles right now, and so we're tracking that you are in Los Angeles. As you go through the internet, we still know that you are in Los Angeles. And so since you're in Los Angeles, we will feed you ads that are relevant to Los Angeles. I mean, that's the use of tracking in a lot of cases, is the ad service, and it's the main one that comes up these days. So when you say tracking, it can mean so many different things, from literally tracking every move you make on your cell phone to identifying the place you're in as you visit different sites or go to different places physically while carrying your phone. From the beginning, tracking is kind of a neutral activity. I always think of like that first beat of human care is I'll keep an eye on you. But like I'll keep an eye on you can be comforting, it can be scary, it can be weird. And when your computer and your internet connection and your phone are saying, I'll keep an eye on you, sometimes, again, that can be comforting. It can be nice to know that your location is being reported to your family or something like that. But it can also take on other overtones. So one of the reasons why I find the idea of, say, corporations keeping track of us a little concerning is what's their motivation for keeping track of us? Well, usually it's because we are a resource for them, a source of money or information that they can use to make more money and get more information. Why is that a problem? It's not just about being served relevant ads. It's about making you into a person those ads are relevant to in many ways. So it isn't just that your profile information and your tracking information changes what ads you see. And for years, people have said, I don't click on ads. It doesn't matter what I see. But they'll also change what kind of content you see. Are you going to see stories that challenge your views or reinforce your views, or slowly work your views into something else? Because we're constantly making ourselves out of the media that we consume, whether you're watching TV shows or reading books or looking at stuff on the internet. It's giving you ideas. It's giving you perspectives on the world. It's giving you news and the way you feel about the news.
So the FTC has a broad set of rules and laws put in place over the last many years regarding protecting people's data. And now this conversation is obviously picking up steam, let's just say. Do you think that those laws that exist right now address any of these issues with online user data tracking? And do you think that with these current discussions going on in DC about privacy laws, etc., do you think anything is going to come of that?
Well, I live in GDPR land. The GDPR has not been super effective in accomplishing all this, but I still support it because I don't think you solve these problems overnight, and I think it's a step in the right direction. But will Washington solve it anytime soon? No. It's just too new and too complicated a project for them to kind of take on instantaneously like that. Part of the problem is that our culture has not really caught up to our technology. And always, to some degree, the solution to that is education more than legislation. For one thing, people in Washington don't know this stuff. This isn't what they do. And my hope is that we can do more to educate them. But ultimately, you need a net literate, educated populace to have a good internet. I wish I had an easier answer. I think everybody wants a legislation or policy answer when the answer is people just need to know how to deal with online life. And we haven't had the internet for very long. It isn't, I mean, it's part of our culture, but it's not really part of our understanding. Digital literacy is kind of where literacy was maybe 120 years ago. And the answer to that wasn't make everything simpler for people who can't read. The answer was teach everyone how to read. And we did that. Actually, one of the most amazing flips in human history is that we went from about a 20% literacy to about 80% literacy in the span of roughly 100 years. And that's an impressive number, but it's even more impressive when you look at the population growth in the same time. It's a J curve of people who learn to read. As much as I am incredibly happy that you're teaching people about tracking and why it matters, I also think that this is something that we need to teach broadly. Everyone needs to know this stuff if we're actually going to have the kind of agency on the internet that we demand in our political spheres.
So you mentioned GDPR, and we've also got the California Consumer Privacy Act, which was passed recently. And like a huge part of all of these is the user privacy. Do you think that these have worked, or these are just like a starting point? Do you think they actually address any of the issues that we had with privacy?
I think they're a starting point. I absolutely think they're a starting point. There's things to criticize about the GDPR, and I do, as well as in the California law is wonderful for the US and also way too weak and not completely fit for purpose. But I also understand that like you can't get to the right political choices without popular consciousness about those. Now we are getting there slowly but surely. I think more people are concerned with tracking than they were 5-10 years ago. You know, when I was talking about how the internet could track you, people thought I was kind of crazy. But now I'm almost in the reverse position where people are like, your phone is listening to you all the time. And I'm like, your phone is not listening to you all the time. And they're like, you're a dupe. And your phone isn't listening to you all the time. The battery would run out if it was trying to. Like physics just says no. But that said, like your phone doesn't have to listen to you all the time. If it knows where you are, and if your phone is working, it knows where you are. And it can see, say, Google queries from people who are in the same location as you. It can serve you ads about that. And suddenly it can look like somebody who Googled something you were just talking about was your phone listening to you. There's a lot of much more complicated and interesting ways to do this than that direct surveillance. I'm really glad people are worried about direct surveillance, but I want them to get that architecture in their minds. Like if your phone is working, it knows where you are because it has to in order to work. So that means phone companies have an endless bit of path data that shows everywhere you move around. Now, that is the kind of tracking that could be very dangerous, but it's also the kind of tracking that makes modern life doable.
So with GDPR and asking people or companies to say, hey, you have to present the cookies transparently, right? And so I don't see any change of habit on my side, because I'm just going to click yes, like right away so that I can access the content, right? So
I am the weirdo who clicks no on the cookies and then submits.
Yeah, so I guess that's what they're doing with choice, but it hasn't really changed the user behavior or user knowledge, right?
And this is one of the ways GDPR is not successful, is that it's put too much onus on the user. You have to be that crazy person who will actually click through everything to turn off all the cookies. Right now, GDPR isn't in a position to address that. Although that kind of misses some of the point of GDPR, which is that a lot of the real teeth in GDPR has to do with how corporations and organizations manage the information they have and what they can do with it, as much as their interface with the user. So GDPR means that if you're going to keep information, you have to be careful about how or whether you share it. If you're going to try and offshore information, that can get real sticky real fast under GDPR rules.
What is fingerprinting?
So fingerprinting in the browser is a really specific process where you take characteristics about that browser and that user, and you make them into an ID. So the idea is if you move your mouse a certain way consistently, or you type at a certain speed, or it looks at like where your browser is coming from, what the version of the browser is, how you move your mouse around, all these things, they can get more and more unique. The configuration of your computer, how fast it runs, what kind of browser you're using. You start combining all these things and you eventually get something highly unique like a fingerprint out of that. So by fingerprinting, instead of using something like a cookie, which just sets an ID on your computer, you can get something that might be more persistent and more identifying than a cookie over time. There's a lot of kind of back and forth between people trying to do fingerprinting, people trying to defeat fingerprinting, browser makers, for instance, who are trying to prevent people from being taken advantage of. It's a security issue as well. Everyone pretty much can be browser fingerprinted. So despite me using a whole bunch of privacy protecting software, the fact that I use privacy protecting software would be part of the fingerprint that would be used to track me.
That's what I was thinking about with this news by Google that they want to get rid of cookies. And for me, in my head,
So real quick, they don't want to get rid of cookies. That would make the web impossible to use. They want to get rid of third-party cookies. And a third-party cookie is specifically when a server that's not involved between you and the people you're talking to gets to put a cookie on your machine and understand the session that you're having right then. Like a cookie is just a little piece of data that sits on your machine, and another server writes it or reads it. And that doesn't sound like much, but that allows them to kind of like tag you. If you think about it, it's almost like a naturalist. They can tag you and follow you in the wild via a cookie. The main use, the first party cookie, not the third party cookie, the main use of cookies when they were invented, and I was around, it was really cool. We were really happy about it, is that it lets you log into things. Like you couldn't log into anything before they invented the cookie. And that was the initial purpose, was so that you could have a persistent relationship with a website.
So so third-party cookies and Safari and Firefox apparently got rid of them a while back. My question is, why is Google doing it now? What's the significance and how will that change things?
The main use of third-party cookies at this point in kind of the web ecosystem is as tracking for advertising, or tracking for other forms of tracking, advertising, data collection, so on and so forth. Neither Safari nor Firefox or even Microsoft Edge are made by an advertising company, whereas Chrome is. Chrome is Google, and Google is in the business of selling ads. So they are in a really interesting position where they can't get rid of third-party cookies on the face of it because they're vital for ad metrics in order to sell their product. But third-party cookies are not popular because they're used to exploit people, and that's pretty much their only use. So at that point, what they want to do, Google wants to get rid of this unpopular thing, but keep the functionality that they had. And so what they're doing is they're kind of using something that's a little bit like browser fingerprinting. It's not exactly, but they're basically using a few different factors in the browser to create an ID. And they're attaching certain attributes to that ID. And this is called flock. And they're going to use that instead of the third-party cookie to sell their ads. Now, this gets really complicated. The problems with this are really interesting. The first problem with this is that it kind of locks the ad world into Chrome. So it's a way of creating an ad system that reinforces Google's monopoly in a way that I think under almost any reading of monopoly law is illegal. So they're specifically creating a tech barrier to anyone trying to use Chrome and serve ads outside of their ecosystem. Now, you could say they just create that tech barrier by getting rid of third-party cookies in the first place, which other browsers have done. But they're basically coming up with an alternative that locks in advertisers in a way that it's not a level playing field with the other browsers or the other sources of advertising. So I've seen estimates that like it'll bring down advertising revenue for media companies and so on and so forth. I mean, I have very complicated feelings about whether or not media companies should be participating in surveillance capitalism anyway. But the other thing, the more I was looking, we'd have to see the specs on Flock to be sure. But I think there's another really interesting thing Google might be going after, especially if Facebook has gotten a lot of flack, and so is YouTube and so on and so forth, about what content they direct to whom. And Flock, because it kind of blinds this process more than a cookie does, kind of gives Google a little plausible deniability, where they're kind of like wrapping this, they're creating this little package of attributes and selling this like blinded package of attributes to advertisers. And so if they are then pushing conspiracy content to vulnerable people, they can kind of say, it was just a hash. We didn't know what it was doing. It's the advertiser's fault. So like Facebook kind of can't do that because they're a little bit more woven in, like they have a content moderation problem, but Google can kind of be like, no harm, no foul. We just do a hash and sell it by the hash. We don't know that much. We don't know that much about the people we're selling. We've anonymized it. And so we're not responsible. And, that may not be true in the final analysis, but they haven't released the documentation that would tell us whether or not they're trying to write themselves a get out of jail free card on bad content and abusive content. Although, given Google's history, I would keep an eye out for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Quinn, for your time and for explaining these really difficult concepts.